You know what this is. It's WeatherBrains, the world's first weather podcast. Now the video version here on YouTube. This is the pre-show where we often say outrageous things, share boring personal stories and humorous anecdotes. This is for September 17th, 2018. We are into meteorological fall, but for many of us, it doesn't feel like fall, but that's okay. That's the way it works around here. So we're going to, many things to discuss this evening after Florence. Bill, we have so much to talk about tonight.
Good. That's always fun when we have lots to talk
about. Mucho things to talk about. So we're going to get our guests on here. So Bill is sending me magically some email addresses, and we're going to invite this person. And
that person.
Is this Bill Hook?
Yeah.
Wow. We got some big shots on the show here.
No kidding.
That's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
That's beyond cool. Wow. Ooh, I better get my tie all fixed up in here. And
I just came in from a football game, so I'm.
So did you play quarterback, linebacker, or place kicker?
No, I played fan tonight. Watched a kid get a hurt ankle from Coleman, though, so I hope he's going to be okay. Quarterback, we have a really good quarterback on the freshman team.
Okay.
But he got hurt.
So,
quarter.
You see this? This has stirred up a big stink today. This is a major stinkorama.
Yeah.
So apparently the University of Maryland uses warnings only from AccuWeather and not the National Weather Service. Wow. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
There is much to do about that situation. We ought to get somebody from AccuWeather, but we ought to get Mike Smith on here one night, get Kevin on here, and we'll talk about this, and our heads will explode. Hey, Bill.
Hey.
Oh, perfect.
Man, this is an honor having you on the show. Wow, we should be bowing down to the great one.
He may be the longest we've had to wait for somebody that we wanted to have on the show. It's
No,
been like
Bill is
years or more, maybe.
Man,
certainly since the
I
book
think
came
I'd better hang up now, guys.
No, come on, Bill. I mean, we've hit the top here. I mean, I saw your name come on here. I'm thinking, wow, this is going to be a good show here. So
this may be the last show. We may just cancel it after this one.
Yeah, and we've hit the top. There's nowhere to go but down after this. I mean, we got Bill Hook on the show.
So you brought me on here to shame me for a couple of hours, right?
No, we just want you to have 2 hours to air it out here. I mean, this is great. Wow. So Brian is probably going to be off for a while with some health issues. So just so everybody will know that, you might say a little prayer for Brian, but he will get this knocked out, and we'll get him better and get him back on the show. We know that Aubrey is dealing with flooding in Harrisonburg. Kevin has a health issue with his father, and I think he's still out this week dealing with that. But I think Rick hopefully will be here. I would love for him to be on the show. And I would love to get Nate on here. He's been up there in the middle of the battleground. But I have a funny feeling he might be a little too busy.
How'd they let that freight train get in the middle of all of the flooding? That was interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. This is all kind of, we've got all kind of comms issues and consistency issues. This again, for those that don't know, Kim had her baby a couple of weeks ago, and so she's obviously off on maternity leave. Bill, you know Kim Cloco, don't you?
Yes, very well. Big fan. I'm a big fan.
Yeah,
he's the reason he's here.
Okay. Well, Kim is on maternity leave, but I would love to hear her thoughts on the last 5 days with the communication of Florence coming in, getting close, moving inland. Goodness, there's so much to talk about here. We could talk about this stuff all night long. I got into some brouhaha somehow, and I wasn't even involved in it. I have the strangest life of any human being. So I started getting this, social media lynch mob on me.
About what?
Want to know why I was attacking some guy named Mike. He's like a blogger or a hobbyist, and I've never heard of this guy before. So, but I'm thinking, what is the deal here? And so after digging a little bit, apparently, so let's go back before that. So like 10 days ago, this was maybe more than 10 days ago, I put out a tweet that said nobody should be putting out deterministic global model output out to 10 days to scare people or to get clicks and likes and shares. It doesn't work. There's no point in it. And I said at the end of the tweet, a drunk monkey can do the same thing. And again, it wasn't aimed at anybody. It was just kind of the preemptive, let's take a big deep breath and let's show people what we know and don't show them what we don't know, and let's be responsible. And so apparently a television meteorologist in Savannah, Georgia, used that tweet and aimed it at somebody specifically, this blogger guy named Mike. And somehow his people thought that I was referring to him. And I've never even heard of the guy. And I mean, just nasty, hate, cussing. They attacked the TV station page. They attacked my church's page. I mean, it's like, goodness gracious. We live in an era where these lynch mobs just come around, and it's goodness. I have nothing else to say about that. It's just an odd world we live in. And I again, we're all so busy. I don't have time to even get involved in something like this, but I'll go back and try and figure it out later. So Bill, I have invited our other guest, and I do not see her.
Yeah, she wrote me this morning, and I asked for a test, and then I never heard back from her today. Tanya Francine, Bill. And so I don't know if she'll join us or not. We sent her an invite. I'll email her too, just in case.
Is Gina coming on the show?
No, she's snowed under also.
Well, darn. That's okay. We got Bill here. That's all we need.
So it's going to be three pale males then. Is that pretty much
three old guys. And Nate. Yes. Yes.
Nate, the token young guy.
All right. There we go.
Yeah. Hey, Nate.
And there's not a shred of hair between it.
No. There's not one hair here. Oh, man. I'm so glad Nate's here. We could just let Nate run with the show here. Nate and Bill.
Well, it just shows how hard the wind has been blowing, right? So yeah,
that's right. I'm sure having four girls under the age of 8 has nothing to do with my lack of hair.
And we have to wait till the bottom of the hour, guys, to start because they hit us on local television. And Bill, we are on local TV here.
Yeah.
Okay. We don't have any. We for you, we don't worry. But when Chuck Doswell comes on, we have to bleep him.
Now I do have some incredible echo here. Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Right. So I have a lot of delay here and a lot of echo from something.
I am not hearing any echoes or delays here on this end.
You guys are good.
You sound clean as a whistle. You look good. Good bandwidth. I mean, often when we hear that echo, somebody doesn't have their headphones plugged in, but I think everybody does, and I'm not hearing anything here. And So,
Yep.
and again, Bill, just so you'll know, most people listen to the show. About 3 out of 4 listen, 1 out of 4 watch. But it is on live local television, which we're about to join in 3 seconds. So here we go. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to WeatherBrains pre-show here. Welcome to our television viewers. About to start the show. I think everybody's here that's going to be here tonight, and it's going to be good. We're going to talk about all kind of stuff. We'll talk about Florence, communication issues, social science aspects, the good, the bad, the ugly. We got Nate in the zone, man. I'm excited to have him. I'm so glad Nate's on this show. We have many questions for you.
I hope you're ready to be disappointed.
No, you have all the answers. All right, let's get the recorders going here. Let's get this thing started. So here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey, this is WeatherBrains episode number 661, the weekly show that's all about weather for September 17th, 2018. And let me just say up front, a lot of our folks are away, but hey, this is going to be a really good show. You want to latch onto this one because we're going to talk all about Florence, the forecasting aspect, the social science aspect, the good, the bad, the ugly, what happened, what didn't happen. If anybody's frustrated, anybody has a rant, this is where it all happens right here. So hang on for that. But Brian Peters, he's going to be out for a little bit on sick leave. Kevin Selly is out. His dad is doing better, but he's still taking care of his dad. Of course, Kim Cloco McLean is on maternity leave. Rick Smith, we think there's 50-cent beer night at Hooters in Norman tonight. So he's apparently he's dealing with that. And Aubrey Urbanowitz is working a flooding situation in Harrisonburg, Virginia, with the remnants of Florence. So a lot of our folks are either on sick leave or maternity leave or something's going on here. But we've got Nate Johnson. Nate, have you survived the last 5 days?
Well, by virtue of being here, I can say yes, I absolutely have. But I tell you, it was it's amazing. I looked at some of the MRMS rainfall data this afternoon, and just across from Raleigh to the county seat, one county south of here, the difference in rain is almost a foot. So, you know, we got off easy here in Raleigh, and we still took a beating. We had a lot of power outages, tens of thousands of power customers without power here. Some flooding. A lot of the typical places took on some water, but you do not have to go far here to get in a really bad way.
Wow. Yeah, we'll talk a lot about Florence, but before we do that, Bill Murray, let's bring in our very esteemed guest.
Yeah, I think we've had him on the wait list for longer than any other guest that we've ever tried to get. But Dr. Bill Hook is a senior policy fellow and serves as the associate executive director of the AMS. He also still runs the AMS policy colloquium every year, the summer policy colloquium. And he has this fabulous book that he wrote in 2014, Living on the Real World. Bill, welcome to the show tonight.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm certainly doing better tonight than I deserve, considering the company I'm keeping.
So are you in Washington, D.C., Bill?
Yeah, close enough to Washington, D.C. I'm near the fringes of the swamp. And I'm
Are you through draining it yet?
Swamp has not been drained.
Well, that's good. Well, we're glad you're the shepherd of it. So that makes us feel a little better. But you know, it seems like these problems like James encountered, you know, in the weather community, you know, go into all aspects of our lives. So it gives you a sense of despair at times, Bill. Inside all of our communities, that there's this polarization that has gone on. Have you figured out any way to lead us out of the miasma here?
Well, I think that, you know, maybe we all have to learn how to get comfortable with the miasma, and we need to adapt. So
you're saying we need to move our cheese, huh? So you say we should just move our cheese and get on with it, huh?
I think so. Yeah. No, well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I've admired this program from afar, and the three of you in particular. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
So Bill, a big premise of your book, which is fascinating, and I've had notes on it now for nearly 4 years, and I've wanted to talk to you about it. But now that we've got you here, you have a theme that runs through the book that we've lost touch with the real world, and because of this fact that we're not getting along at the same time, this is really putting us in a very difficult and perilous situation. So, but you say that solution is in each and every one of us.
No, I think that's true. So, time was there were no meteorologists that roamed the earth, and everybody was his or her own meteorologist. You know how to look at the sky and figure out what the day was gonna. Everybody was a meteorologist, and looking back, we realized we had a name for that period of time. We called it Eden. It's all been downhill from then, When you look at Babylon, for example, and they started all sorts of irrigation and engineering of their little bit of turf to grow things a little better. And the next thing they knew, they had too much salt in the soil and nothing was working. And, they looked at the nomadic lifestyle and said, maybe that was pretty good.
Well, that sort of trial and error science can get you in trouble pretty quickly, can't you? But it has a place, doesn't it, Bill? And maybe we're not using it as much as we would like to, huh?
Yeah. Well, it can and it can't. So trial and error, if you remember wood shop, and I remember wood shop, I'm not sure Nate was old enough to ever have wood shop, but your shop teacher would tell you about trial and error, and he would say, measure twice and cut once, and, always keep track of cut outside the lines and plane down or file down to the line. And meteorologists do that. We don't look at the storm 5 days out, the Hurricane Florence, and say, okay, we've got it all figured out. We can go on to the next problem now. We follow it hour by hour right into the coast. We watch it ebb, we watch it flow, we watch it intensify, we watch it change direction, and we're constantly noodling it along.
Now, you mentioned in your book, Bill, that resource development is important.
Yeah.
Environmental protection is important. And then resistance to hazards is important. And pick two.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to get all three. Talk about that for a minute.
And we tend to cheat a little bit on that. We're not bright enough to get all three of them nailed simultaneously. And so we settle for just getting, we used to settle for just getting one. We wouldn't worry about the hurricane until it was bearing down on us. That works okay if you're in a small village or something, but if you're in a city of 4 million people like Houston, you've got to know it's coming weeks in advance in order to have an effective strategy.
And one of those things is obviously environmental protection, and it seems like in general we may be either taking some steps back or ending regulation that might be overbearing. And I don't know what that really is at this point. I don't know that we'll know for a while. But what's your take on where policy is going in America with regards to the environment?
Yeah, so well, I think policy is being reworked all the time. So administrations come and go and they change things. I'd be interested in Nate's situation down there in North Carolina. We're reading that these floods are turning into big pollution events. They're overwhelming the hog lagoons and the coal ash and every kind of junk that was stored in the floodplain. There's this slurry of dangerous stuff moving downstream all over the state. And that kind of thing, in the aftermath, people will think a little differently about all that. So how's it looking Hey.
Well, it's interesting to bring that up because that was one of certainly the lessons that Floyd tried to teach us in '99 was with all of the flooding that we had in the eastern third of the state, that the Hog Lagoon pollution especially was just awful. And in the wake of Floyd, some policy was changed, laws were passed, practices changed, especially with some of the larger commercial farms in the eastern part of North Carolina to really limit the kind of damage that hog lagoons would cause. We saw much less of it in Matthew than we did in Floyd. And we've seen some with Florence, not as much as Floyd. It's still to be determined, really how much. But overall, it doesn't feel like that's going to be as big an issue. But we've now had the issue of coal ash that wasn't really on the public radar screen in '99. That's now a thing. And we had some failure of coal ash ponds in Matthew, and I've heard of at least one with Florence today. But the bigger question, we're still, as Governor Cooper mentioned in one of his press conferences today, we're still at the front end of this. We don't know. Most of the rivers have not even crested in the central part of North Carolina, which means necessarily they haven't crested in the eastern part of the state, where most of that, especially the Hog Lagoon problem, is sort of lurking. And some of the video that I've seen, especially, in the southeastern quarter of the state, I've seen, farms that have been flooded, up to the rooftops of buildings. And if there's any sort of pollution or whatnot hanging around there, that's all in the water now. And we may not know about all of that until the water begins to recede and we see what gets dumped. But all I know is, there's not enough money in the world to pay me to stand in that floodwater, period. Because even without the pollution, that's some nasty stuff. And we got some critters that live in this state that like to float around in that water I want no part
of. So Nate, how would you rank the storm in terms of what it looks like, the devastation and the impact compared to Floyd and to Matthew and other terrible storms that have hit North Carolina?
I said on Twitter and on Facebook as I was giving updates, I said this is not another Floyd, it's not another Matthew, it will be the first and only Florence. Yeah. And it's its own storm. We have to judge it and take it on its merits and the circumstances that it brings with it. I think when the final tally is done, for the state as a whole, this has the potential to be worse than both Floyd and Matthew. But I don't know that, comparatively, it seems to be focused a little farther south and a little farther inland than Matthew was. Matthew was really primarily an east of I-95 event and really more north. Wilmington didn't have a whole lot of trouble. They had some, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it was in places like Greenville, Goldsboro, and Tarboro, and places right on the river. Those places are still going to have it bad, but they're not going to have it as bad as we did 2 years ago with Matthew. But farther south, Lumberton, Wilmington, some of these places, those are the places that are going to look at this and go, who's Matthew? What's that? Florence is going to be the storm that everybody remembers. I don't know if you've seen this. It's let's see if I can screen share it. But it's this fellow by the name of Randall Monroe. He is a former engineer at NASA, and he did this cartoon a couple of years ago. Let me see if I can screen share this. It'll let me do this real quick. Yes, that's what I want. So this is the cartoon, and it's called XKCD, and I highly recommend it. There's some funky language in it from time to time, but it really is great. And what this is a map of what's the worst hurricane anyone in your town remembers. And he's, as a former engineer, he's not just throwing this stuff up there. It's actually got some science behind it. And if you look at this, and it hasn't been updated to include Matthew or Harvey, obviously. because obviously I think you'd see, large portions of Southeast Texas having been rewritten, but it does include, Katrina and, of course, the big storms around here in North Carolina, Fran, Floyd, Hazel, Matthew, some have Isabel. I think a fairly healthy chunk of the state we're going to rewrite this map to include Florence, especially here in southeastern North Carolina, and over maybe even toward the Charlotte area, although I'm not sure that this has been quite as bad from in Charlotte. Chapter of this book has yet to be written. And we may not know for another couple of weeks, really, until all the water makes it all the way across the state until we see what's going on. But this is a great map because it's not just, it's not just what the worst hurricane was in terms of wind speed or flood. He's done some work to figure out, societally, what's sort of the worst hurricane that people would remember, whatever causes them to remember it. And I found it to be pretty accurate.
Hey, let's Bill, I hate to interrupt you. Let's talk about Florence for just a minute, because everybody's kind of, and I want to hear Bill's opinion on this as well. What I want to do is bring up a tweet from a friend of yours, Nate.
Yes.
This is from Greg Fishel, and of course, Greg is the Elvis of weather in North Carolina. And I want to talk about. I want everybody on the show here to grade the warning process. But I found this interesting. Right. And when Greg speaks, a lot of people listen, and it says, "As long as I'm an employee of WRAL TV, I can make one promise: never again will we show the forecast line in the middle of the fan. That line represents where the storm won't be. Everyone focuses on the line, and it's the wrong thing to focus on. We should and will do better." So, Nate, let me start with you. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can say, because of, my new position, I'm not directly involved in producing graphics at WRAL anymore, but I can say with some certainty that the line was not a part of their graphics, with Matthew, especially I'm just looking at, Hurricane Matthew, for example. The cone was sort of the forecast, but, the weather service and the Hurricane Center, I feel like they learned that lesson back in Charlie. Remember that very small, tight hurricane with, made landfall as a Category 4, 10 miles away from a Category 5. I mean, this was a beast. And I remember I was working at an ABC affiliate at the time, and I remember, watching Tony Perkins, and he was standing in downtown Tampa, and they were supposed to be in the middle of a hurricane. It moved I think it was the Republican National Convention that year out of Tampa, or they postponed it or something, because they thought that the storm was going to go in Tampa, and it didn't. It went into Port Charlotte. But because people seem to focus more on the line, the Hurricane Center said, fine, we're going to not put the line on the graphics by default. Right. And I think that's very wise. I mean, I think I think it was Max Mayfield, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Max Mayfield who said that the safest place to be in a 5-day forecast is under the 5-day forecast from the National Hurricane Center. The idea that they, of all people, and this is something that I don't think anybody in our business does as well as the Hurricane Center, but they acknowledge what they can and what historically they can't do. And they are upfront about it. And I can't count the number of discussions that have happened just with this storm that said, don't focus on the track. Our average error at this forecast period is 150 miles. I mean, they're basically telling you, what other business tells you with that kind of honesty and upfrontness, this is what we know, and this is the limits to which we know it. And I think that's something that we need to get better at as an industry, and I think we need to get better at communicating it. And I think one way to do that is to say, look, the entire cone is where the center could be. Historically, this is our best guess. It could be anywhere in that cone. And let's focus on, where, not just the one point in the cone, but let's think about what the impacts would be if it's over here versus over here, because we got to prepare either way.
So Nate and Bill, I'm going to ask you in a second, and Bill Murray also, all three of you, to grade the National Hurricane Center. Give them a grade, Nate, on their job forecasting Florence.
So I think there's three components to this. There's, the track,
Right.
There's the timing, and there's the intensity.
The intensity. Yep.
I think the track forecast, I think you've all seen the tweet that went out, a couple of days ago, that the landfall point was like 2 miles away from where it was 5 days ago. And there really wasn't a whole lot of shifting at the coast. Inland, we did have some shifting because at one point it looked like it was going to slide back up north and really wallop the triangle all the way into the mountains of Virginia. As a powerful still category 2, category 3 hurricane moving inland. And then we started to see the pattern shift and it looked like it was going to slow down. But overall, I don't know of anybody in North Carolina, something that I think the forecast is good in the sense that one of the things that I haven't heard a lot of, if at all, is I didn't think it was going to be this bad, or I didn't know it was coming. There are some folks that are still, I think we still have some work to do, and we'll get to it, I'm sure, on this program. But I think we got some work to do on wind versus water. But I think everybody in the path knew it was coming. I thought that even people this far inland did a really great job of getting ready for this hurricane. And I love my brother to death. I'll tell the story. I love him to death. He's not the kind of guy to listen to the local officials and head inland, right? I call him a couple of days. I call him back on Tuesday of last week, and I said, hey, what do you guys plan on doing? I was expecting to need to talk him out of staying, and he's like, we're already packing the car. We're heading inland tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I was like, man,
right,
that's great. But I think there's a lot of people like that who looked at that forecast and said, I want no part of this. And they headed inland. We had 14,000 people in shelters in North Carolina as of midday today. A lot more people moved and got hotel rooms, or stayed with family. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And some of those folks are going to go back to homes that maybe never lost power, that didn't have any damage. And I hope they realize that there was something they didn't live through as a result of going inland. And just because they go home and their house is fine, doesn't mean they shouldn't have evacuated.
Yeah. So just to build a little bit on some of the things that Nate was saying. So first of all, I'm going to start with something very scientific. You were asking me, Jim, whether forecasts were getting any better or not. And I noticed that Ken Graham is giving the forecast for some of the TV networks now. He comes on fairly frequently, and he's a lot bigger than I am. So I'm going to say nothing but nice things. I'm going to say nothing but nice things about how the Hurricane Center is doing. And I think part of it is being old. I remember hurricane forecasts from the 50s and the 60s and so on, and it was kind of a crapshoot, and there was a lot of uncertainty. And the experience recently is just so much different, particularly if you look at last year and you think that the 3 big hurricanes that we had that made the news, they had impacts in quite different ways. So Harvey shows up and the forecast says this thing is going to sit there and you're going to get 40 inches of rain. And that verified, and then Irma comes along and they said this thing is going to go in a straight line. And when it gets to the Keys, it's going to make a right turn. And it verified again, a totally different kind of behavior. And ditto for Maria, you could see it coming from Puerto Rico a long time ahead of time, and very good prediction about wind damage and what it was going to do to the infrastructure. I mean, so they not only got the atmospheric physics right, they got the impacts right. Now, you mentioned Greg Fischel, and I've got another story I have to say about Greg, which is that
I think we all have stories about Greg.
I was born in Raleigh, North
Carolina. Give us a good one.
I was born in Raleigh, and I moved north as a kid with my parents, and so I lost the accent, and I can pass for Yankee now, and so on.
But you still pronounced Raleigh correctly. I give you credit for that.
My parents retired to Pinehurst. And so there I am, I'm struggling through my whole career. I'm something like 60 years old and my mother's in her 80s. And I finally rise in her estimation on the day when she learns that I knew Greg Fishel. She said, "You know Greg Fishel? He knows you." And I rose in her estimation, and I had succeeded as a son because he had come down to Pinehurst. He talked to those people, and they really loved him down there. And you mentioned the cone of uncertainty and that line that Greg was so eager to get rid of. And probably my greatest influence on today's meteorological community was hiring a fresh college graduate from the University of Maryland in 2003 by the name of Gina Esco. And she's taught me a lot from the get-go. I mean, she's sort of the butterfly that created the hurricane in the meteorological community. She started looking at that cone and getting rigorous and scientific about it. And she told me that I should never engage in cheap philosophy about it. So I'll let Greg say the line should disappear, but she would drown me in focus groups and what they would say and so on.
So Bill, talk about FEMA and Nate, weigh in on that too. How have we done on this hurricane, and have we learned any lessons from Maria and Harvey?
Wait, time out, Bill. Bill Hook, give a grade to the National Hurricane Center. How do they do?
Okay, well, I'd give them an A, and again, that's comparing them over the last 50 years and so on. I think there's a tendency, particularly in our community, to think about things that could have been done better. But you go back to Nate's brother and the fact that Nate's brother didn't wait for him to understand that he had to evacuate. The credibility of the whole weather enterprise, public and private sector, is looking a lot better than it did just a few years ago.
So, Bill Murray, grade the Hurricane Center.
Well, I thought the Hurricane Center did a great job with their forecast. I thought the interesting thing was watching the models and their performance.
Wow!
I thought amazing how the European grabbed that retrograding of the storm back to the southwest. And I wonder, I know we've got a new GFS coming. Bill, have you followed that at all? How did that new experimental model do with the hurricane?
I really haven't.
I think that's it. Nate, have you studied that at all? Have you seen anything?
I looked at it a little bit. From time to time, I found that because this was hitting me and not me as an individual and not me as a professional. I tended to focus less on the model's day-to-day waggling and wobbling, and I tended to focus more on the opinions of some trusted, people, the Greg Fishels of the world. And then I spent a lot of time, like a lot of people do, looking, waiting for that next discussion, hitting F5 and waiting for that next discussion from the Oracle in Miami to figure out, what their thinking on all of this was. And I think I was probably more sane, for it. But I did check in from time to time. There's some conversation on some message boards and whatnot about it. It looked like that the new GFS, the FV3, finite volume 3 core GFS, did better, more or less, than the current GFS by and large. But the GFS did not do as badly. I mean, you think about, and going back to Bill's point, I mean, you look at what the GFS was doing, with Sandy or some of the bigger storms, and even just recent memory. And the GFS did a much better job with Florence than it had in past storms. It wasn't like it was predicting a landfall in New York City while the European was pegged on a landfall just north of Wilmington. Right. We're still in the general ballpark. And I think if all you had was the GFS, I think most of the people that needed to be ready still would have been ready. But somebody asked me on Twitter a little while ago. I said, they asked the question of, should we just focus on one model? And the question, should the Weather Service or Hurricane Center use one model for forecasting major events? Forecast discussions reveal that they oftentimes use a blend. Curious to your thoughts. And I said, look, the Hurricane Center forecasters are craftspeople. They're crafters, and the models are tools. And when the tools are used well in the hands of competent and experienced craftspeople, then the resulting work usually is pretty good. But it's when you rely on one model to the exclusion of others and don't acknowledge the limitations of the one thing you have that you start looking at all of your problems and, with your hammer in your hand and thinking they're all nails. So I think they did a really nice job. You didn't get me to give a letter, James. I thought you were going to let me off on that.
No, go.
But I would agree on the one hand, compared to where we were, I mean, clearly it's a solid A. But I know the folks at the Hurricane Center, and I know they're not happy with it. They're always trying to get better and trying to improve. And again, going back to things that I think they do better than any other part of our industry is going back and really being ruthless and critiquing their forecasts and putting out reports and determining, what went well, what did poorly, and really spending. They have the luxury of something of an off season. So they're able to sit back and spend some time really honing in on the last season. What lessons did we learn from that, and how can we apply those in the future? And I think you see that in the consistent downward trend in our error, the error for the track. And I can't help but think that the intensity forecasts would be just terrible if we weren't putting that kind of work into it.
So let me ask you guys this. Do you think that the downgrade to Category 1 was responsible for some people not taking action is it right before it came in?
So I think anytime you've got millions of people, not just hundreds of people looking at a forecast like that, sure, there are going to be people who respond that way. And I think you've hit on a real challenge for us. The forecast is better than the STEM education that our citizens have been given the whole time that they were in public school. We've got a very technological society these days. And I think a lot of the public, we didn't really prepare them well with STEM education in public school for the kinds of information they're being fed today. The ability to distinguish between fake news and real news, the ability to see past something like a Category 1, just a simple single digit to characterize something as complex as a hurricane. That's a problem for America going forward.
What do you say, Nate?
Bill's right. I mean, if you subscribe to the theory of the long tail, then the tail's long enough. You're gonna find somebody who will attribute that downgrade message to acting less than they would have otherwise. But I think, and this sort of opens up the conversation that I think is on a lot of people's mind right now is, we spend a lot of time. I mean, this hurricane was on the books for 14 days and counting. And for 12 of those days, 11 of those days, the only judgment that we made about how strong or how bad it was going to be was by estimating what the winds were going to be in the storm, what they are in the storm. Right. And I mentioned that I was invited to give a presentation at the Hurricane Conference this past year in Orlando. And right after, let's keep the intensity track improvements going. Let's try and get those improvements in the intensity forecast and to get a consistent trend. The next thing was we need to find a way. And this is, I put this at a grand challenge level for our enterprise, is to find a way to talk about hurricanes that captures the totality of what they bring, because it's not just wind and it's not just water, although water kills more people. But in places like Puerto Rico, in a lot of cases, it was the wind that did the damage. There was a lot of water, but the wind still does damage, and we can't ignore it. But we do need to do a better job of communicating the water potential, both the inland flooding as well as the storm surge. And then we need to factor in the fact that these things aren't steady state and they move, or in some cases, in the cases of storms like Harvey and Florence, they don't move. So we need to find a way, and I don't know what that is. That's why it's a grand challenge. Or if I had the answer, I'd answer it. we need to find a way as an enterprise to really not reduce them, to resist the urge to reduce them to a one-dimensional categorization, because they're too big for that.
But Nate, I don't think I heard that anywhere. So when I was watching forecasters on CNN or PBS or wherever they were, or Ken Graham or Ed Rappaport or whatever, everybody was very careful to say, hey, this is going down in terms of the scale number, but the storm surge is going to be big. The precip is going to be big. The impacts are going to last for days after this hurricane has come and gone. So I thought the people in front of the camera were meticulous and high quality control about getting all these points. Now, if you and I don't take it in as viewers, that's on us a little bit, or again, on the education system that doesn't help us deal with subtle information.
I agree with you. And I think by and large, the presenters, whether it's the broadcast meteorologist, Governor of North Carolina was talking about this being a flooding event, for days leading up to, the first impacts. So I think that message, in spite of ourselves, we managed to get it out probably better than I think we ever have. But I still think there's room for improvement, because again, for 11 days, the way we talk about it, this Saffir-Simpson scale and the way we categorize hurricanes, whether it's a hurricane or not, has more to do with wind speed than it does anything else.
Yeah.
But as storms like Allison can teach us, they don't need to be hurricanes to cause widespread misery, death, and destruction. And so I think there's something to that. And again, I don't know what the answer is. I wish I did. But I think this is a direction that we clearly need to try and move, so that our internal messaging to ourselves about how we talk about it lines up with, what we're saying to the public.
Well, let me chase a rabbit and ask you a question, Nate or Jim or Bill or anybody, and that is, what about winter? What about winter storms? So if we don't name winter storms, we don't have a single parameter for identifying. Sometimes we're talking about ice. Sometimes we're talking about blizzard conditions. So do we do a better job in something that's a little more amorphous or diverse in the way it presents itself?
That's a good question. And I think giving it a name, we do a better job, I think, by and large, when we attach something to it, some sort of moniker. And I think that if you look at the reaction to a Harvey or a Florence as compared to, say that little tropical disturbance, I don't even think it was a tropical disturbance that moved on shore in Pensacola, Florida, and dumped 2 feet of rain in a day some months ago. No name, but still caused misery for a fairly large number of people. Or if you look at a tornado outbreak or a line of thunderstorms like the derecho, I think it plays to our psychology that we want to name things. We want to be able to call it something, if it's Snowmageddon or whether it's Winter Storm Bill or what have you. I think the challenge is there's power in naming things. That is a power structure thing, and I think it's something that needs to happen at more of a community level. And by community, I mean, taking taking hurricanes as an example, we as a community have empowered the National Hurricane Center to do this on our behalf. I think we're going to go there. I'm just going to 800-pound elephant. Where the Weather Channel went wrong was that this wasn't a community-led thing, and it should have been. It should have been agreed upon criteria, and people will tell you that the criteria the Hurricane Center uses, Joe Bastardi has railed against this from time to time, that the criteria they use are not exactly perfect. But it's something that we've all bought into and we've agreed to, and I think that's where the Weather Channel ran wrong with the naming winter storms thing. I think the idea has merit, frankly. I thought I wrote about that when they started, that it's not a terrible idea, but I think it's something that needed a little more vetting and a little more community buy-in before it went out to the public. Having said that, I think it's something that ought to be considered. I just wish we could all get around the table and consider it. It sounds like there have been some motions in that direction recently.
So one more thing, Bill Murray, and I'll turn this back. I didn't mean to hijack the conversation. Everybody wants to know about the hurricane. So we had a situation today, Nate, where the University of Maryland apparently put out an alert to their students that there was a tornado warning in effect. And in fact, I'll do a screen share. The National Weather Service did not have a tornado warning out for the campus. As it turns out, apparently the University of Maryland contracts with AccuWeather, and they issued their own warnings. And again, for those watching, this was an alert put out by the University of Maryland Police Department. The tornado warning that was issued by AccuWeather is now canceled as of 6 p.m. The rotation is shifted to the north. Please remain vigilant as storms will remain in our area throughout the evening. And then underneath that, Howard Bernstein, who's a meteorologist up there, he says, all you're doing is causing confusion and panic. I appreciate the desire to keep the campus community safe, but I feel you're engaged in a very dangerous practice. You may also breed complacency with too many bogus warnings. Bill Hook, what do you say about this? Yo, Bill.
Well, one thing I was wondering while you were reading this was whether anybody else in the discussion here remembers the event maybe 20 years ago where a tornado did hit the University of Maryland campus and a couple of students were killed. I think one of them was the daughter of one of the emergency managers there at the university. He thought that his daughter and her friend were in danger because they were on campus, and he encouraged them to drive home. And the tornado threw the car against a tree and killed them both. So I'm wondering if this doesn't date back to that event, that tragedy, and the sense at the University of Maryland about, gee, we don't want this to ever happen again. We're going to be very careful about what we put out with regard to our students.
Do you think that they don't have confidence in the National Weather Service to issue accurate warnings?
You know, the Russians have James, so the Russians have a proverb, which is the soul of another is a dark forest. So you don't really know what's in their mind, their process there. But what I see people doing is willy-nilly thinking, okay, I'll have a public forecast, but I'll also hire this consultant. I can almost picture the marketing conversation that got this contract, and we'll have a belt and suspenders. And they don't think too much about what they're going to do when the two are in conflict, or they're not showing the same uncertainty or using the same nomenclature. You know, we just got a new smart TV, and it's a lot smarter than my wife and I are. You know, we got all these networks now, and we got streaming video, and I'm looking at a remote control that had to be programmed by artificial intelligence. You know, the guy from Best Buy Computer Geeks or whatever it is comes out and, you know, puts it in, you know, hooks it up to the laptop, and we're just struggling to keep up with all the information we've got.
I just, again, in my opinion, and I don't sound preachy here, but we have to communicate a simple, unified message. And it's my opinion that if every entity in the weather enterprise begins to issue their own warnings, it will be nothing but pure chaos. Right. And tonight was a good example. There was a lot of chaos going on up there. And we've had this problem in Kansas. I
want to advocate for
Jim, I agree with you. And you've been just one of the things that you do that I don't is you preach. You do get preachy, and you preach with clarity, and you bring us all to Jesus and so on. So it's fantastic. But the thing is, the world we live in now is an information soup. I mean, let's just look at the politics of it all and the things that are going on. And you and I pick up a newspaper, it's just got, or you go channel surf, and just there's every thought out there. And an important life skill used to be driving a car. And that's not going to be an important life skill for Nate's kids. They're going to grow up and the car's going to drive them. But the most important life skill they can develop is how to wade through conflicting sources of information and draw conclusions on their own. And we just all have to learn how to do that.
All right, Nate, go.
In the moment, you know, I hear what you're saying, James, and by and large, I agree with that. But here's where the world gets a little messy. I think AccuWeather and private entities, you know, their role is to do and there are things that the Weather Service doesn't do. They're not going to give long fuse, you 2 and 3 hour long tornado warnings for specific clients that might need 2 or 3 hours to take whatever evacuation or other preparation steps they need. I'm thinking of hospitals, for example. Mm-hmm. It's going to take more than 5 or 10 or 12 minutes or whatever the average lead time of a tornado warning is to evacuate a hospital, even just to get people out of the rooms and into the hallways. It's going to take longer than 12 minutes to slow a 3-mile long freight train down before it gets to a track that's going to be affected by some severe weather. And those are just a couple of examples. And I think that's a role where companies can go out and go to a private vendor, whether it's AccuWeather or WDT or one of the others, and request that they get these higher lead time warnings. They're willing to exchange the longer lead time for a higher false alarm ratio. Mm-hmm. And they understand that going in. So long as they're making an educated decision, I got no problem with a company providing that service. So long as they're doing it in the best interest and with good intent and with the best science that they can bring to bear. And I believe by and large that the people at AccuWeather and WDT and others, I think they do that. Where I think it gets sticky is when the people buying the warnings, the University of Maryland's, the Kansas Turnpike Authority, to go back a couple of years, it's when those meant for private clients warnings get exposed to the public. And I think that's done with good intent, but I think that's where it can become messy. And I don't think that genie's going back in the bottle. You know, you're not going to pass a law in 2018 to muzzle a company like AccuWeather from providing warnings, or to muzzle a client from relaying those warnings to whomever they choose, so long as it's allowed within their contract. So I think it does come back to Bill's point that we're going to have to accept that in some cases there will be conflicting information. The question now is, how do we prepare people to deal with it? And how do we make sure that they understand it and make the best decision, the most informed decision they can for the situation that they're in?
All right, Bill Murray, I'm done hijacking the interview. Sorry.
No. What else do we need to talk about with Florence?
Before we leave this, Bill, if I could, I'd like to go back to James a little bit, because I'm thinking that I'm going to reverse myself now a little bit, Jim. And I'm going to give you a football analogy, because it seems to me that it's one that we're ignoring in this whole field. We put all the pressure on the broadcast meteorologists to speak with clarity and to get the impacts right and the uncertainties right. But a football coach, when he sees the wide receiver run the wrong pattern, he doesn't go into the huddle and yell at the quarterback and says, "You've got to improve the impact of your messages that you're giving in the huddle here. You know, you've got to do better." He grabs that wide receiver and says, "What were you thinking about? Stop thinking about your girlfriend in the stands and think about the play that the quarterback called." And the public has to learn how to do that. And I think one of the things that James, you and Nate and the others who have been in a single market for a long time you develop that quarterback wide receiver kind of understanding with your public. And so even though there's a plethora of outside messages and all sorts of chatter, they're paying attention to you, and they've got a history with you, and that covers a lot of this. There's a lot of good communication that occurs because you guys are at this a long time.
Yeah, let me piggyback on that. I will say, and Nate, you chime in, I think the local broadcast meteorologists in the affected areas have done an exemplary job. I think of Ed Piotrowski in Myrtle Beach, the tireless work that this guy has done over the past 5 days. And I've watched him. He works for my company, and I know Ed, and I can watch him on this monitor, and his messages were clear, easy to understand. It cut through the chaos and the confusion. And I think he communicated uncertainty, risk, just beautifully. Nate, don't you think the TV guys did a good job in the markets affected?
Yeah. Everything that I've seen, being able to sample here in the Raleigh market, and then, so many, even just 10 years ago, you'd have to have a satellite dish and somebody else's satellite receiver to be able to watch, out of market television. Now you can just dial it up on the internet anytime. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to see what some of our colleagues are doing. And I think by and large that, the job was fantastic. And in some cases heroic. In terms of getting the message out, and some of these stations doing 60, 70, 80 hours continuous coverage without taking a break and whatnot. Obviously they're cycling people in and out, but and doing that while their own families are having to pack up and evacuate and head inland and having to worry about that. Same thing for the Weather Service folks in the Hurricane Center, the WPC, and then the local offices, Morehead City, Wilmington, the Raleigh office, all, Wakefield, all having to deal with this at some level or another. And I think that our weather enterprise has a lot of this, to be very happy about, but I still think there's room for improvement. And we've got, now I think the count is almost 36 people who didn't survive. So clearly we have some work to do. I don't know that we'll ever be able to get that number to zero for every storm, because we can't control, we can't dictate what people do once we give them the message. But I do think we still have some work to do to improve that messaging. And that's just, I think we'll approach perfection asymptotically. I don't know that we'll ever get there, but there's always room for us to improve and get better. And I think that we need to do that.
So Nate, you mentioned that
Murray,
preparedness was good and readiness was pretty high for this hurricane. How would you rate the response, which is unfolding in the wake of it?
Everything I've seen has been pretty good. And for a lot of folks that don't know, disaster response starts locally. And it's only when the local response is overwhelmed that it goes up to a state response. And then when the state is overwhelmed, then it becomes a federal thing, and you get FEMA and other things involved. It's the Stafford Act, and that's how that all plays out. And I think all of that, the state, a number of counties and communities, evacuations were ordered in a timely fashion, not too soon, but not too late. I thought, by and large, what I've seen of the recovery, watching, local television and some of the national networks, has been pretty good. We saw, the mutual aid, this idea that, agencies can count on outside groups to come in and back them up, has been great. You're getting, New York Task Force 1 was down here doing rescues, and NYPD's driving down, I-95 trying to get here. City of Raleigh has sent police officers to Wilmington to help direct traffic and all this other stuff. I mean, there's a lot of pitching in, and it's the kind of thing, it's the way the system is supposed to work. Now, 2 or 3 years from now, we're going to look back at that, and there are going to be cracks that we're going to find. There are going to be situations that were missed, and we don't like that. But the reality is that we're not perfect. We're all human, and we need to learn from this and improve the next response, whether it's for us or for somebody else. But I do see some of the lessons that were learned from past storms, including Harvey, being put into play here, especially in the messaging and the consistency of some of that messaging from some of the officials.
And so how badly is the transportation infrastructure damaged Is it too early to tell, Nate? What's the
It's, at one
situation?
point, at one point today, Wilmington was essentially cut off. I-95 is closed at a number of spots. There's a stretch of I-40 that's miles long that's underwater. I can't think of the last time that happened, certainly for that distance. We're still too soon to know how bad the damage is. I've seen a lot of pictures of roads being washed out. There's concern that part of I-40 may be compromised, at least in some way. So we don't know the full damage of the transportation infrastructure. I do know that there are people that have been able to make it to Wilmington, and some people that have been able to make it out of that area using back roads and things like that. But if you're in Wilmington, by and large, your paths out are on a boat or by waiting. And waiting for the for the water to recede, which, like we've talked about, is going to take days, if not weeks, in some cases. But the DOT here in the state. I mean, I remember the former governor of North Carolina a number of decades ago called North Carolina the good roads state, and we will be again once all the water cleans up. But we've got some work to do. So
I was in Hatteras a couple of years after Isabel hit, Nate, and they all had T-shirts that said the Category 2 storm or the Category 3 storm surge. How did the storm surge end up impacting the coast with Florence?
It seemed like the higher surge numbers, we set a record for the Cape Fear and Wilmington, set a record high as a combination of river flow and storm surge. The storm surge was really even worse a little farther north as you get toward the Jacksonville area, Topsail Beach, and you get up toward Morehead City. That area seemed to take more of the brunt of the storm surge than some of the areas down to the south. And that frankly surprised me a little bit. I knew it would be bad, but I thought it would be sort of consistently bad and not focused quite as much as far north. And then some of that had to do with, the angle of the storms coming on shore, and then the way the wind was blowing. You've got the sound, the Pamlico Sound there, and some of the river basins were in the mouths of these rivers sort of angled up with the line of the wind coming in. And so that helped to just make it that much worse, that much farther inland. So, but I think that, the storm surge was more consistent with what you'd expect with not a Category 1 hurricane, but a 2 or a 3. And I think a lot of that was because of how strong it had been, and then how large it was in terms of size, being, 300-400 miles wide by the time it made landfall. Even if your sustained winds aren't 140 miles an hour, that's still a lot of wind. That's a lot of mass and a lot of momentum being moved around, and it's going to have an effect.
Now, I didn't study them closely, but on Friday I had the chance to look at a lot of the storm surge products from the Hurricane Center and was struck by, the really high storm surge values that were extremely far inland. And it seems like that was borne out in places like New Bern, North Carolina. Talk about that situation for a moment, because I think a lot of people were surprised Saturday morning when they woke up and saw that, and perhaps they shouldn't have been.
And that's just the unique, we call it unique, but the coastal topography of North Carolina, and the fact that you've got these barrier islands, but you've also got the sounds, and they're affected by, long periods of wind fetch. And in some cases, it's easier to move that water around because there's less of it. And so you put that water under a large fetch for a long period of time, and it forces it up the riverbanks and up the river channel. And you start having problems with flooding farther inland than you might have, closer to the coast. And somebody, with more coastal geology expertise can speak better to that. But I think it was just the combination of, where the center came on shore, the size, and then just the orientation of the wind being directed almost directly up the river path that caused so much of the problems along the coast and that far north and along the rivers inland.
So Bill Hook, where do we stand in this country in terms of weather policy at this point?
Where do we stand in terms of weather policy? Yes.
Where do you think we are, and how far do we have to go, and what do we have to do to get where we need to be?
Well, yeah, so here's a thought. I'm not sure this is what you're looking for, but this is what I think of every time we have a situation like this. We really have two cultures in this country. So we have a hurricane disaster or a flooding event, And the next day's news shows some people sitting next to what used to be their homestead. And they said, you know, this was terrifically hard to bear, but we're going to rebuild like before. And people, we look at that and we understand about the importance of place and so on. But there's another culture that's the culture of aviation. So after a plane crashes, you know, say the wing falls off an airplane, the way it used to do in the 60s. You don't have people standing around the crash scene and somebody from the NTSB saying, well, this was a terrific tragedy, but we're going to rebuild this plane like before. They say something entirely different. They say this must never happen again. And the thing is, you know, so we have this reality in natural disasters. We watch the losses go up every year in terms of the property loss. And it's kind of noisy because the hurricane seasons changes and so on. But going up, and we say that's because more people live on the coast and they've got more possessions and there's more economic activity and so on. Well, there have been 4 times, 5 times as many flights worldwide today as there were during the 60s. And we've seen fatal fatalities from airline crashes go from 2,000, which is what it was, 2,000 a year in the 60s, down to 0 in 2017. Now, the NTSB and everybody said, okay, that was a lucky year. No commercial aviation fatalities. And sure enough, in 2018, we've had maybe 100. You know, here it is in September, you know, 100 fatalities. And they've done that because when the wing falls off the plane, they say, was it the design of the wing? Was it the manufacture of the wing? Was it the maintenance of the wing? Was it pilot error? You know, and we need to do that with regard to repetitive loss in this country. So what we're going to see after this disaster is people all over North Carolina are going to be rebuilding like before. And I understand why that happens. But what we really should have is people moving to a different place, a little higher ground, building on stilts, changing the way they live and move. And if we learned from experience and weather the way we learned from experience in aviation, we could drive these losses down.
So, Bill, you say that meteorologists are specifically trained and inclined in a certain way of thinking that can help us solve a lot of these problems in society. Explain that, and how can we turn that thought into action?
Yeah, okay. So thank you for bringing that up. I talk about that in the book a little bit, and it's got to do with, again, what we've been talking about. The wonderful thing listening to you guys is just how thoughtful you've been about these weather events of the last few days, last couple of weeks, and the run up to Florence and so on. And there's a whole community of people who are thinking very carefully about it and not going on to some other subject and just thinking about how can we improve these forecasts a little bit the next time out. And we're thinking as a community, we talked about AccuWeather versus the Weather Service and so on, but in fact, there's much more of a community feel and working for a common goal of public safety and economic growth and so on. And I think the world could learn a lot from meteorologists and how we cooperate and how we think about a good larger than ourselves.
I think that's an important point, Bill, that I think if we step back for a second, when we have these disagreements about the role of the private sector or the role of the public sector or whatnot, that we need to take a step back and recognize that, trying to make a living and to make money doing weather is not a bad thing. Nothing wrong with that. Neither is a career in public service. Nothing wrong with that either. But step back even further from that and recognize that we are, by and large, we're in this for the same reasons. We're in it because we're weather geeks. We're in it because we're fascinated by the power and beauty of the atmosphere, and in some cases, maybe a little scared of it, and that's okay. And I think when we step back and acknowledge that nearly every meteorologist, every meteorologist I've ever met is in it for that. We're not in it for glory. We're not in it to get rich, but we're in it because we have this shared passion of the atmosphere and for using our knowledge of the atmosphere to help people make better decisions. We step back and recognize that we have that common purpose and that common, bond. Then it gets very hard to be accusatory about what other people are doing. And we tend to give people the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's something that is missing in our society today. By and large, it's not just endemic to the weather community. I think we still do it better than the average, folks out of the weather community. But when we give each other the benefit of the doubt, I think that the conversations tend to be more productive. They tend to be more solution oriented and less, this is my turf and I'm going to protect it. And when we are doing that, then we move together more effectively.
Okay, guys, we're going to take a quick break here. It's 35 after 10 o'clock Eastern. So we're going to take a break for Tony Rice and the Astronomy Report. We're going to come back with our picks of the week.
Awesome.
And a whole lot more here as WeatherBrains rolls along. So everybody just hang in there.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your astronomy outlook.
The September equinox arrives at 1:54 UTC on September 23rd. That's September 22nd at 9:54 p.m. EDT and 8:54 p.m. CDT, and so on. Equinoxes, like solstices, are moments in time, which means they arrive at the same instant worldwide. Here in the northern hemisphere, this marks the beginning of astronomical autumn. The sun will rise a little bit later and set a little bit earlier over the days coming. The opposite is true in the southern hemisphere. Now, the name equinox comes from the Latin equus, or equal, and nox, or night. On this day and night are roughly equal in length. If you find yourself on the equator that day, the sun will be directly overhead at noon. On this day, the sun also rises pretty much due east and pretty much due west. Use this to find the cardinal points from your home. This is also how the orientation for ancient architectural calendars were selected. The equinox also coincides with cultural events around the world, especially in the northern hemisphere, where the harvest is also being celebrated. In Japan, Buddhists mark the equinox with a 6-day celebration called Ohigen, which means other shore, paying respects to their ancestors who have left for the land of the dead, the other shore, which according to tradition lies due west, where the sun is setting. It's seen as a period of transition. They take time to visit their ancestors' graves and tidy them up a bit, as well as visiting living family. Ohigen even has its own flower, the Higenbana, also known as the red spider lily, which blooms around the time of Ohigen. It's also known as the ghost flower locally and is associated with death, which is appropriate because the plant's poisonous. A cheerier celebration is the Moon Festival, also called the Mid-Autumn Festival, and is celebrated in China and Vietnam, on the full moon nearest to the equinox. This year that falls on Monday, September 24th. Parts of the family dinner followed by a big outdoor picnic under the moonlight. Moon cakes are indispensable to the festival, and they're made from red bean or lotus seed paste. Though here in the American South, I suppose a moon pie with an RC Cola could be substituted in a pinch. That's your astronomy outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
And Aubrey is out doing flooding work tonight for television, so we'll do a double email segment next week. And Bill, I'll warn you, we're going to do a pick of the week in a minute, so you'll need to come up with something weather-related. Maybe your book. What do you say, huh? I mean, that wouldn't be a bad pick of the week. So we'll give you a minute to think about that. We've been basically doing a weather roundup here for the last 90 minutes, talking a lot about Florence. You know, the one thing it's interesting to me, fellas, I've been doing some stuff on the television side. To me, it's very interesting. While we had the historic rains in North Carolina from Florence, Don't know if you guys noticed how much rain they had on the Texas coastal plain in the last 5 days, related to a no-name tropical wave, better known as Invest 95L. And Nate, that was a big deal. I mean, there was some serious flooding around Galveston and Houston. And I don't think that nationally the story got any traction because of Florence.
Yeah. And I've been helping, monitor Facebook traffic and whatnot. And it's interesting that there are situations in times like this where, you simply do not have the capacity to cover every angle that you could possibly cover, that there are too many it's too bad in too many places to get crews there and lay eyes on it all at the same time. And I think that's the situation with the flooding that we're having in Southeast Texas today and in the last few days is there's only so many minutes in a 30-minute newscast, at a national level. It was talked about locally. The local folks were paying attention to it. The Hurricane Center was monitoring that, obviously, and keeping a very close eye on it. The local media were talking about that and talking about the impacts, just like we were talking about the impacts of Florence here. But in terms of the bright lights of the national attention, to play off of something, there's only one Jim Cantori, and he can only be in one place at a time. And if you were his bosses at the Weather Channel, you're probably going to send him to the storm that has a name and a category, as opposed to the storm in Texas. Right or wrong, right. That's the decision they'd make.
So, Bill Hook, you're the smartest weather brain we've had on this show in a long time. Do we need to change or revise the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale?
Do we need to change it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I think the thing that every person hates to hear more than anything else is some intro like you're the smartest this or the strongest that, or I just feel like I should refuse that invitation. So you can always improve something like that Saffir-Simpson scale. There's been a lot of criticism, a lot of concern about it that we've heard from Nate and others. And sure, you could find something better, but look at say the economic figures like gross domestic product or balance of trade or unemployment statistics. Those are single numbers that we see once a month from Department of Commerce or something. They're oversimplified. Everybody knows that, but it's kind of a little bit of a check of where we are. And I think Saffir-Simpson falls into that a little bit.
Nate, what say you? Do we need to revise, change, have a new scale for? Of course, we have the surge warnings and watches now, but what do you think about the good old Saffir-Simpson scale? Is its time past?
I think there was a time when the Saffir-Simpson scale explicitly included things like storm surge potential and minimum pressure.
That's a great point.
And it was stripped out after Ike. Because Ike, as a Category 1, did far more damage than any Category 1 storm should have ever expected to have done. I think we have to recognize, and this goes back to Bill's point about how we're educating people in school all the way up through high school and college, that whenever you reduce something to a single number, like the Saffir-Simpson scale category number, you are necessarily throwing away information. If you reduce it to a wind speed and ignore the rest, you are ignoring the rest. That is not a bug; it's a feature. That's why we have scales. To Bill's point, the GDP, we want to have that check. What we as a community need to recognize, I think we know this internally. We're struggling with how to solve it. Is recognizing that check is in and of itself inadequate. But we don't really know how to come up with something that is similar for surge potential and flooding. And the reason for that is, by and large, there are two things that we can measure with some confidence, even before the hurricane hunters can get out to a storm. There's something we can measure with some confidence, and that is the size of the storm and using satellite presentation, its overall intensity. And those methods are very well documented. They have weaknesses, but they're very well known in the community, and we take those estimates more or less to the bank. But there's no way to tell what the surge potential of a hurricane is going to be when it's still a wave coming off the African coast, because you don't know how fast it's going to be moving when it interacts with land. You don't know how strong it's going to be, how big it's going to be, the bathymetry of the land surface underneath the water. I mean, all these things that get factored in. We can't really start talking about that until 2 or 3 days out from a storm. So we spend a week and a half talking about the thing we know, the thing we can measure, the thing we can estimate with some confidence. And I think we're struggling to find a measure that will give us something that we can actually measure, not a prediction, but a right now measurement that will tell us the destructive water capacity of a hurricane. I'm not sure it exists. So I think we do need to find something to go along with a Saffir-Simpson scale, or maybe go back to the days where we took an estimate of how bad it was going to be and did some sort of projection. But even that, again, we're reducing things down to a single number. And in the process, we are reducing things. We can't get away from that. That's just a limitation of the scale.
I think Bill Hook made a very astute point, is that we have to teach kids coming up how to handle this volume of information that they're going to be receiving. They will be bombarded with information, and how to process that, how to determine what is credible, what is bogus. I think that's a very important skill set, Bill, and the horse is out of the barn. We can't control all this stuff. It's going to go out no matter what.
So, James, a question building on that. What do you think artificial intelligence might provide as an assistant to each of us for coping with this kind of information bulge?
I think it's important, and I think there's great possibilities there. My biggest struggle in life, and I would say for 99% of the people listening to this show, it's time management. And how do you manage to, I don't care if you're a trillionaire, you can't buy another microsecond in a 24-hour day. How do you handle the volume of information coming in and process it and determine what is true, what is not true? And on the same token, I think AI could help us on the way out. I think there's a great future there. So we'll see. All right, guys, listen, I've got to go do some television. So real quick, Mike Seidel, Nate, go.
I think, and I'll take some heat for this, but I think I've met Mike. I know the people at the Weather Channel. They're not faking it. I think that a single video clip, even 10 or 15 seconds, cannot adequately represent what the totality of the conditions that were being experienced by Mike and what he was preparing for in that moment. And so same thing with the Anderson Cooper freeze frame of him during, I think it was Ike or Harvey standing in his camera guy standing on a platform and he's standing in a ditch up to, basically past his waist. And, the accusation was that we're trying to fake it or make it worse than it actually is. Number one, the weather's bad enough. I don't need to make it worse by faking it. Number two, I've never met, at least any of the people I've met are not the type of people to fake this stuff. I don't have that kind of time. You don't have that kind of time to think about it. You just go and do it. You just go and report what you see and you move to the next thing you see. And I think we have to recognize that one video clip or one still image does not capture what's actually happening in the moment, and does not capture the totality of what Mike was dealing with. And besides, the fact that he leans is a thing. They talk about it, in Atlanta. So I think it's something that is being overblown. I do think the response from the Weather Channel didn't make it any better. But it certainly doesn't look good. But I find it, I go back to, I'm going to give my colleagues a benefit of the doubt. And I don't think that, he's faking it or anything like that, simply because if you've ever been in that kind of an environment, you don't have the kind of time to think about how I'm going to fake it. It's easier just to tell the truth and to be, and to report what you see.
Bill Hook, any thoughts from you on the Mike Seidel video that's gone viral?
I'm hearing about this for the first time.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, the bottom line is Mike Seidel of the Weather Channel was doing a live shot, and he was, he was saying it's as bad as it's been, and he was having a hard time standing up, and all of a sudden in the background, two guys just walked by in shorts like there was no bad weather at all. And so, now that's gone viral, and he's under this attack, fake news, and all this kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
I will agree with Nate. I mean, people don't know what it's like when you're doing live television. That you really don't understand that. And I've been out there in a case like that, and you're having to worry about your IFB wire and your mic and your audio cable and everything else. It's a lot different from just taking a casual stroll. But I would give Mike the benefit of the doubt as well, which is not the popular opinion. The world seems to think that they're, fake news, they're faking it. But I hate to see the mob jumping on him like that.
It certainly plays into a very popular trope right now that, the media are fake news and that we're having to embellish or play up the story when in reality, I've been in coverage like that. I've been out there. You don't have the kind of time to even think about it. You're doing and you're reporting. And, Mike just doesn't strike me as the kind of guy to even think about that. So,
yeah. All right. We got to do TV here. Sorry, guys. Bill Hook, for people who want to get your book. I noticed on Amazon, they've got like 14 copies left. What's the best way to find the book?
Well, Amazon is still the best way to do it because it's the quickest. You're just a click or so away. My AMS bosses will probably hate the fact that I'm not trumpeting that we go on the AMS bookstore and look at it. Amazon will get more copies if through some miracle those 14 copies were to be sold. So,
hey, those WeatherBrains listeners will eat those things up. They'll be sold just like that this week.
I'll look forward to seeing that. Okay,
Yeah,
and I can give them the Bill Hook guarantee, which is if they look at that book, it won't be the biggest waste of a couple of hours of their time that they've ever spent in their lives.
And the name of the book is Living on the Real World, How Thinking and Acting Like Meteorologists Will Help Save the Planet. So that is Bill's book. So let's do picks of the week. Nate, go. What's your pick?
Obviously, my friends, my relatives, my colleagues, my fellow North Carolinians are going to need some help in the next days, weeks, and months. And my colleagues, former colleagues at WRAL, have put together a nice resource of not just where to give your money, but how, what sorts of things are needed and how to make sure that your dollars are going the farthest. It's WRAL.com/hurricane help. All one word. And the governor of North Carolina has a disaster relief fund. You can contribute to that through there, contribute directly to the Red Cross, Salvation Army, whatnot. But do keep us in your thoughts and prayers over the months and really years. There's still people that hadn't recovered from Matthew when this hit and hit them again. So keep North Carolina in your thoughts and prayers in the coming years.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we'll share that across social media too. All right, Bill, this is your chance. Give us a pick of the week. Anything you want. Go.
And you're talking about Bill Hook as opposed to Bill Murray, right, Jim?
Yes, sir. I'm talking about you, Mr. Hook. You're up.
So there was a book that everybody was talking about indirectly, but you saw it mentioned in USA Today and so on. It's entitled The Ostrich Paradox and Why People Underprepare for Disasters. It's written by a guy at the Wharton School named Howard Kunruther, and he talks about all the social science of why you and I feel optimistic or we can't deal with anything complicated, and we don't prepare for disasters the way we should. And it's written in terms that you and I can understand.
Awesome. And we're going to put the link up on weatherbrains.com.
That'll be great. The Ostrich Paradox.
Awesome. I just looked it up and I saw it, and we're going to put the link up on the show notes here. But Bill Hook, real quick, before we go, what's happening at AMS? Anything we need to know?
Yeah, so the AMS is doing all it can to prepare for the centennial, the 100th anniversary of the AMS. And broadcasters could be a big part of that. I think broadcasters would be the difference between just a few thousand people celebrating the event, and maybe 100 million Americans realizing that weather services have really improved a lot over the past 100 years, and how broadcasters have done that.
Awesome. No, Nate, we'll get in. Nate, he runs like 27 TV stations now. So Nate, you can make that happen.
Right.
You're kind of a big deal now.
Nate's the man.
Yeah,
No,
Nate is over the NBC O&Os here, but again, looking at the clock, I hate to cut this thing off, but I got to cut this thing off. WeatherBrains typically is on the air every Monday night at 9:30 Eastern, 8:30 Central. You can watch at live.bigbrainsmedia.com, but we know most of you listen. If you want to get in touch with us, the email address, it is email@weatherbrains.com. We promise a double email segment next week, and the show notes, picks of the week, everything, it's up on the website, weatherbrains.com. So on behalf of the entire WeatherBrains crew, I'm James Spann. Thanks for listening. Have a great week, and God bless.
Thank you, James.
Bill, you're the best. You're a legend. We're honored to have you on the show. Come back anytime.
James,
Thanks a lot.
It was a privilege. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thanks.
Nate.
Thank you, Bill. Good to see you.
Thanks, Nate. Have a good week.